Liberal Currents presents Half the Answer with your hosts, Caitlin M. Green and Trent R. Nelson.
Well, happy days are here again, and, well, understanding a question is half of an answer, and this is, of course, half the answer. This is your host, Trent R. Nelson, and, of course, I am joined, as always, by host Caitlin M. Green. She's a linguist, an editor with Liberal Currents, and so much more. Let's not downplay this. And I am a historian of sorts, as well as an editor, and we can downplay that all we'd like. And Caitlin, who do we have joining us on this lovely and beautiful day?
Well, Trent, I am simply jumping up and down with excitement because we have Toby Buckle, who is the host of the Political Philosophy podcast and editor of What is Freedom. He podcasts and writes about liberalism, republicanism, ideology, religion. He recently wrote an amazing essay for us at Liberal Currents about the concept of heroic masculinity. And so that's what I wanted to ask about today. We're going to take a deep dive now.
Let's go.
Hi, Toby.
Everyone want to be a hero.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
I'm so excited. So yeah, heroic masculinity is having a moment at this time. So thanks to you for prompting me to do a deep dive on where it's being talked about and why. And also, I'm pretty mad at you because now I've had to read a bunch of stuff that makes me very frustrated.
The Chris Bernard article.
Well, that's one of them, but that's truly not the end of it, is it? Because there's a lot out
No.
there.
It's kind of a genre of writing at the moment. I haven't read all of it,
Yeah.
but
You couldn't. It would take up like your whole life, basically.
Yeah.
But why don't we just start basic? And can you tell us what is heroic masculinity?
Oh wow, okay. What I'm responding to in the article you mentioned is an article by Chris Bernard titled "All Men Need to Be Heroes, and America Should Give Them the Chance." And even the title I can't find kind of a little grating. So what's interesting and why I sort of took a bit of a breath in answering that is a lot of the invocations of heroic masculinity that we have are actually really not super clear on what they mean by it. I just sort of worked with a common sense, I think what most people are walking around with in their head definition of heroism, which would be some sort of act you take for others, some sort of perhaps emergency or like short-term thing, and something where you've got to risk yourself or you take on some sort of burden to help others.
Right.
That's what I had in my head. That's what sometimes people like Chris Bernard, when they talk about it, seem to be operating with. But then at other times, he seems to be using it more as just like a broader catch-all for men feeling respected and valued. He talks about how we need to have plumbers and engineers in our society, and that's part of heroism too. And you're sort of left wondering if the concept covers that much. What work does it even do? And also, who's against plumbers or engineers?
Well, that was going to be the question, Toby, is don't we have plumbers and engineers in society currently?
Is that this one paragraph of Arnard, you would actually think we didn't? Or that liberals, I think in his presentation, liberals have the pendulum has swung too far, and liberals now have such a sneering anti-masculine thing that we look down on people who do any masculine coded profession. It, I guess, would be the view. But like I say, and then you also have invocations of heroic epics by people like Jordan Peterson, or Elon Musk likes to do this as well. I would say it's not always clear exactly what they think they mean, and I'm just not sure they're being. I'm not sure that they have a super consistent definition of hero. I know that's not a very interesting answer to start with, but I'm just not sure that they have a.
It's good because it's true.
Interest. Yeah.
So in my journey into figuring out what heroic masculinity is even supposed to be, it seems like every time one of these speakers is asked to really talk about what it is and why we need it doesn't take very long before they pivot into what seems like the real thrust of the heroic masculinity discourse, which is hitting at feminism.
Right.
So what you end up doing is you have somebody like Caitlin Flanagan writing in the Atlantic or appearing on Real Time with Bill Maher, explaining that the point of talking about heroic masculinity is that feminists have caused boys to feel bad about being boys and
Mm.
have decided that men are bad, and that anything men do is bad, and that society is essentially going to crumble because of it, right?
Yeah, I think I mean, it's a reaction, and it's a reaction. Some of the quotes you shared with me ahead of the interview that perhaps we'll get to in this discussion
Yeah,
seem to me to be very much reacting to and pivoting off this idea of toxic masculinity,
right.
which I think, as it appears on the right, we can discuss perhaps its origins in sort of social justice and so on, and whether or not we find that a useful phrase. But I think as it appears on the right is kind of a caricature of their own creation, right? Like, to use
Of
the
course.
online parlance, they're inventing a guy, or in this case, a girl, to get mad at.
Yeah. So Caitlin Flanagan in The Atlantic writes, if the noun masculinity can be modified by the adjective toxic, then there must exist its opposite, which can be revealed by a different adjective. What is it? Right. And then she posits that it's heroic. And so what she's doing there is pretty commonly what happens with critiques of the idea of toxic masculinity, which is to say that it is simply all adjectives and all nouns have the same relation to each other. And so saying toxic masculinity is not just a critique of a certain way that masculinity is enforced. Oops, I bumped my stuff. The way that masculinity is enforced in a way that hurts people. Actually, we're talking about masculinities that are bad. And so therefore I should get to talk about masculinities that are good, and it will be an equally coherent concept, just by virtue of the fact that I subbed in an adjective, right? What has to happen then to justify that idea is a lot of rhetorical sleight of hand about saying, well, I'm not talking about when men do something cowardly or cruel. I'm not talking about when women do something heroic. I'm talking about heroic masculinity as its own thing. And so then you have to say things like, heroic masculinity is so important because it's what got those guys running up the Twin Towers after 9/11, or on 9/11. And then you have to do this little parenthetical about, yes, I know there were female first responders. Yes, I know 3 women died saving people, but that's not what I'm talking about right now. That's irrelevant. Well, it's only irrelevant because you declared it irrelevant, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of it's a reaction, right? I think toxic masculinity is one of those phrases that really sort of lives in the minds of the I hear it far more from the right than I do from the
For
political
sure.
left.
Yeah, of course.
Um, and yeah, it's a caricature of their own creation, right? They are making up a guy
Mhm.
to get mad at. And yeah, if you're understanding toxic masculinity as saying either all men are bad, or that there is something inherently bad, or at least potentially inherently bad about masculinity, you want to pivot off that and say, no, masculinity is something that is inherently good. As I said, I find it quite difficult to offer a definition of heroic masculinity because I just don't think there is one. I think it's a way of saying we believe masculinity and manhood is under attack by an increasingly feminized and feminizing society, and we are asserting something against that. I think
Right.
that's the thrust of it.
Well, it isn't, it was mentioned, it's been mentioned here several times so far that the term heroic masculinity seems to be vague and ambiguous to varying degrees. And toxic masculinity, as you just mentioned, Toby, seems to be used in very broad ways by the political right. Uh, does it not seem as though both are ambiguous for the sort of sake of finding common ground to dislike feminism?
Yeah, and I mean, I think so, to zoom out a bit, I think there is something obfuscatory and probably intentionally obfuscatory about this whole genre.
Of course.
I think, that there's a lot of blanks that are left when we're asked to consider the fate of the poor men and that men are lonely and disrespected. There's often not a lot of detail behind those narratives. We're just expected to sort of intuit something in them and agree with it.
You
And
project
when-
yourself into them. You project your own idea of what this means into the void.
Yeah, and to be fair, and Caitlin will probably be able to say much more about this than me, this isn't an unusual feature of political speech. Whereas, say philosophical speech, you might aim for clarity and precise definitions and, logical formulas. Political speech often aims for a certain sort of ambiguity so that different members of the audience can read their own meanings into it. On our side, consider, Obama's hope and change and the different sorts of meanings people read into that. I do think that the think of the poor men genre of articles, which is kind of what I call them in my head, are a little bit more obfuscatory than just saying men have problems. I think what we're expected to read, I think that there's a surface level meaning and an implied. I think the surface level meaning is that there are things in the world as a result of liberalism or feminism that negatively impact us as men, right?
Right.
I think the implied is that women are getting out of their place, that women are no longer automatic social inferiors to men, and that there is a dignity and respect that we are deserving simply by virtue of being men that is no longer being afforded to us. So I think it's more than just what all political speech does, which is leave it a bit open for the audience to read in. I think we're both expected to read in instances of our own supposed disrespect or isolation or loneliness. I think we're also supposed to read in a feeling of indignation that our social inferiors are being taken away from us.
That's really well stated, and I think you can really see it when you have people defending this concept of heroic masculinity. I'll bring in another quote. So on Real Time with Bill Maher, which I watched because of you, thanks Toby. Caitlin Flanagan was on there talking about heroic masculinity, and she told a story that relies deeply on not sharing the details of the story to make her point. So she said, there was just some big article in the New York Times. Some woman was like, oh, I'm really concerned about my 3 sons. They like stories about saving the day. They like playing video games where they can be the hero. That's called heroic masculinity, and it's a real thing. We need it. It's been part of humanity since the beginning. Okay, so if you do go look at the story, which I did, it was a woman talking about how the only media available to her sons and the only media that they were consuming involved 2 men fighting each other in physical combat, and there being a victor and a loser, right? She didn't say, I'm upset that there happen to be stories about heroic men. She said, I'm upset that my children are exclusively consuming. She just wants variety for her children, right? And that is actually unacceptable to this kind of think of the poor men narratives, right?
In the Chris Arnard article that I was responding to, in which he links to another article which he characterizes as saying heroism is an outdated masculine ideal that leads to violence and imperialism. I'm very slightly paraphrasing, but that's how Chris Arnard presents that. And I click through and read it, and it's kind of this long critique of how people like Elon Musk and Jordan Peterson cite heroic poetry without really engaging with the material properly or even understanding what it means. And I don't know, you could agree or disagree with that article, but it's not really at all what Chris Arnard characterizes it as. It's not saying heroism writ large is always bad. And I honestly don't know whether he's being self-consciously deceptive there, or he just has really strong priors. I wonder if he just gives it a quick scan and is like, oh, effete, liberal, academic author, front of the class kid.
Yeah.
This is probably being arrogantly, contemptuously dismissive of the lives of real men. And like a 30-second read, that's what he takes from it, cites, goes in, and trusts that no one in his audience will follow up on it.
Yeah.
I don't know, but either case, that direct parallel
Yeah.
to the article I was
I
just
think
writing.
part of what's happening is that they're finding a keyword and reacting to that without looking at the full context, right? So, for example, another thing that I watched for this was a PragerU video about the Boy Scouts of America becoming just scouts, and allowing girls in. And Heather McDonald from the Manhattan Institute did a video for them, explaining why that's actually an assault on Western civilization. And so she uses the APA, the American Psychological Association report about men and how to talk to men about masculinity as one of her pieces of evidence. I'm using, for the audio listeners, air quotes here. So she says the concept of toxic masculinity was active decades before the American Psychological Association declared traditional masculinity a malady. Civilization creating traits such as competitiveness, stoicism, and the desire to provide for others, the APA declared, were not behaviors to be promoted, but to be fearful of. Now, what she did there is she did select out a direct quote from the APA, but you know how a sentence has a subject and a predicate? She only gave us the predicate. She cut out the subject because that would mess up her argument, because the APA is specifically saying that an over adherence to the supremacy of that kind of masculinity can cause men to engage in behaviors that are bad for their health. For example, not seeking out mental health care, taking risks, getting into conflicts, the kinds of things that you don't want men to do over much, because just like for women, it can cause them real problems.
Yeah, and I mean, I think so. So listen, we may disagree on this. I'm actually something of a moderate on a lot of social justice language. I think, there's certainly phrases, toxic masculinity might be a good example of this, that are a bit clunky and potentially counterintuitive, and that sometimes on our side, it's fine as an in-group talk for people who all know what that words mean, but in terms of broader communication with the public,
Mhm.
it might not. I personally don't generally use sort of deep social justice concepts a lot in my speech or writing, but, and it's a 300-pound concrete but, I don't think that any of that makes any difference to how it will be perceived or characterized by the right. I
Mhm.
think that's a matter of just, you
Yeah.
want your own presentation to be clean and something you're happy with, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Um,
and this is
I,
an
I
example of a professional organization talking to members of their profession to say,
Right.
here are some of the risks that we're noticing in our
yeah,
male clients, and here's some things that you should keep in mind when you're advising them, right? And then it gets taken way out of its context and used as an example of, like, what do you call it? Woke institutional capture.
yeah. There's just very much this dynamic and engine of finding stuff to get
Mhm.
outraged by, and their audience for this is primed now, and they want to be outraged
Yeah.
by it. And it doesn't, a lot of it is straightforwardly false. A lot of the things that gets shared on sort of right-wing pages, if you dig into them,
Mhm.
are just so I think a classic example of this, I could be fact checked, but the 72 genders chart,
Right,
um
sure.
I
Right.
believe, which right-wing pages went nuts for, I believe, fact check me, but is the invention of a right-winger. That wasn't even, you could imagine some well-meaning and enthusiastic, social justice person was like, I'm going to try and get down every gender identity, and it's fine, it's harmless if a bit over the top. But apparently, it wasn't even that. It was something that they made. Um, and if I'm wrong about that one, there's certainly a lot of others.
Well, Hirschfeld was famous for his sexual institution in Germany during the Weimar of like sort of cataloging all of these differences in gender, physiological gender, as well as like the mental makeup as well. But certainly the right wing has not appreciated Mr. Hirschfeld's work, as the pictures of the Nazi book burnings illustrate fairly obviously. But I think that each individual or each group sort of utilizes an innovation of thought in their own way, right? Magnus
Yeah.
and those individuals were trying to use it to sort of liberate the understanding of us all as it concerns the diversity of human form. But again, other groups use it as sort of a mark list, as sort of a list of things to ensure that we're watching out for, because perhaps they're nefarious, Toby.
I don't know. I mean, I actually don't know that bit of history particularly well, so I can't comment on that one. I think in general, you have an audience. What's happening is pretty simple. You have an audience that's very, very primed to get mad about perceived social justice excesses,
Right.
and they feed them it, and it's sort of a feedback loop, right?
Right.
And they're simultaneously radicalizing their audience and bringing them into this
getting radical.
worldview,
Yeah.
but also continually throwing them things that confirm those
Yeah.
priors. And I don't think it actually really matters to them all that much if it's true or not. I think they like getting mad about stuff. It's this kind of like, see, this is what I mean. Tampons in the boys' room in school. This is,
Right.
which one actually wasn't true, and two, why does it matter if it was?
Who cares?
Tampons are not hurting anybody, right?
Yeah.
They're famously very soft.
But just this kind of, oh, the world's gone crazy, and look at this, and see, this is what I'm on about.
Yeah.
It's
So
that,
yeah,
right?
it's cherry picking or misquoting or just like picking someone to be mad at, and the time scale is so short with the sort of social mediaification of the way that we think about these things, that you constantly do have to be pulling up a new thing to say, look at this thing, isn't that wild? Don't you hate that? And if it's fake, who cares? Because in 10 minutes I'm going to come up with a new one anyway.
Yeah, and I think there's nothing we can do about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a sort of object level thing. I
Mhm.
think, there are undoubtedly ways that people on the left can use language better. I don't think that matters. I
No,
think that
'cause
there probably
the market's
are.
there.
Yeah,
Right.
examples. What's weird is there are like feminist authors and social justice people you can find who are genuinely saying some really radical stuff. So you don't even have
Right.
to cherry pick. There's stuff out there. But again, I don't think that matters. I think, what we have to do on our side is more warn the men, perhaps even women around us, about what that media ecosystem looks like. And if you
Yeah.
hear someone who is beginning to reflect those talking points, to try and catch them before they get pulled into the online vortex and say, listen, what you're consuming seems like meme pages and YouTube videos and stuff that's quite light and entertaining. As someone who writes and thinks about this stuff a lot, I really want to impress on you, this is hostile propaganda. This is trying to draw you into a worldview that will start with light sexism and go through to real misogyny. And as you keep going down, it'll go through racism and real conspiracy theories. They are trying to suck you. This is a recruitment tool. They are
Yeah.
trying to suck you in to essentially what will become, if you fall far enough, an online cult that will destroy your life. It will, if you really imbue this messaging, it will ruin your ability to have healthy relationships with women. And
then you really will be in crisis.
yeah, I don't think what we're gonna do is get our messaging so good that the right can't ever caricature or mischaracterize it, because they don't care. I think
Right.
what we can do is the philosophers Lassia Nuti and Gabriele Badano have this phrase, a duty to persuade, that as we are in societies that are lurching towards political authoritarianism, that we can try and persuade our fellow citizens out of it, if and when we see them getting pulled into these recruitment mechanisms.
And Toby, what happens when I see my friend? He seems to be falling into this pattern, right? Seems to be falling for these sorts of entry level misogynistic and sexist ideas. And I say all of that stuff to him in as kind of a way as I possibly can. And he looks at me dead in the face and goes, "So you're a cultural Marxist." What do I do? What does a person do? Or perhaps what should they think to themselves at that point?
I think that person is not at the top of the rabbit hole, right? They're like in it now.
Right.
They're a little bit further down.
Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, if I was there, so first of all, duty to persuade does not mean a guaranteed chance of success, right?
Right.
Like,
Of course.
and you want to be strategic and go for the cases that you think at least have some chance of being efficacious.
Absolutely.
I mean, I would say, stand on the truth as best you can. I would say so. For me, I personally think of myself as a progressive liberal, but these are words. People have all sorts of definitions.
Right.
Cultural Marxist is kind of an online conspiracy theory.
Right. Right.
This is something that, if you want, I can really talk to you at length about. They had this whole weird anti-Semitic conspiracy theory about the Frankfurt School. But basically what you need to know is this is not, nobody self-identifies as a cultural Marxist. This is a phrase that has been made up by the right that kind of means everything and nothing.
Yeah.
Yes. Well,
So,
again,
yeah.
I was saying it the other day to Caitlin, is that these how we perceive ourselves is very much indicative of how we perceive others and where we perceive our own thought on the scale of others. So often the folks that use these terms like cultural Marxist, like they believe that they're like relatively moderate. Right. And we appear so far away in these instances for these folks because they don't perceive themselves as being far right or far
Everyone
right
thinks that
adjacent.
they're reasonable, right? That's like kind of just what it is to be a person. Okay, so we talked about the sort of invention of what the feminists are doing to the boys and the men, right? And it often relies on things like straw manning or taking things out of context or just making stuff up. Who knows? The flip side of that to me is a real rhetorical through line in these discussions of men in crisis, which is a claim that progressives and feminists simply won't talk about it or simply won't engage with the idea of masculinity, which to me rings completely false, right? Because progressives do talk about masculinity and manhood, and progressive men are constantly out there trying to say, we need to think of ways to be men that are positive and healthy. It's just that I don't know, we're just not paying attention to them. Is the market just not there to listen to those guys?
So what I've said about this is, you could certainly do a nitpicking on our side, right? Of the ways progressives have talked about men and masculinity.
Mhm.
There's maybe a few edits I'd make here and there. There's maybe stuff I'd sort of say that, like, I don't know, to me as a
Differently.
fairly sort of average straight guy, that just kind of doesn't ring true. And I could talk about what those are. But again, 300-pound concrete but, I don't think that will make any difference, because we should do that because we want our own speech and narratives to be the best that they can for its own sake. But it doesn't matter. They have this view that
Right.
the liberals or the left or progressives or feminists don't like and don't care about men and don't have anything to offer them. And that is what they will believe.
Yeah.
I'll give you, so one specific example of this is apparently a lot of young men don't know how to ask people out on dates and succeed doing that. And apparently the left has really been failing to do that. And so, of course, young men are going to the right and the pickup artists and the so on, because at least they provide a step-by-step instruction. And I looked into it a bit for my article on this, because I'm like, okay, sure, fine. I don't want to fill that gap in the market, but it feels like that's a gap in the, dating advice for liberal men. You can see that might be a thing, right?
Yeah.
Right. Sure.
Apparently there have been attempts. There was a thing of socialist singles nights in New York, apparently. Sure, sounds fun.
Delightful.
The problem was not enough straight men turned up. There's
Mm.
is too many women to make the thing work. And that was relentlessly mocked by these online people who apparently are just poor little hurt boys who need to get a date.
Of
And
course.
so what's going wrong here is, this is slightly cynical, but my read is, say dating advice, but perhaps just say self-help in general. What do I need to tell you with dating advice? Like, I don't know, don't be freaking weird, ask people out. Like, it's not, you do need to put yourself out there. Confidence is good, but active listening is also good. Like,
Yeah.
And self-help in general, it's not telling you anything you don't already know. Like,
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson's make your bed and clean your room is fine as this sort of thing. That's not a horrible precept to live by. The question is, who do you regard as being an authority who you will take that from, right?
Right.
Who to you has the standing such that when they say clean your room, you'll actually do it, right? And I think that's true for the left and it's true for the right. For those of us on our side, we might want something that has sort of an academic stamp on it. We might want something that has a study. We might like therapy has a lot of standing for
Yeah.
people on the left. Or, it might be the crunchy stuff. It might be the crystals and healing and all of that, right?
Mhm.
On the right, what do they want? They want misogyny, right?
Yeah.
What will qualify someone to have that authority that when they say you need to do this, you'll actually do it?
Right.
It's the fact that they'll blame your life's problems on women. That's the prerequisite for us, for people to be understood to have that standing. And so I don't,
Yeah.
could there be liberal people who give dating advice? Sure, and then there must be some out there, but
Right.
I don't think they'd be listened to, because what would qualify you as an authority is that you validate their feeling that women are at fault for everything that's gone wrong with their
Right.
lives.
So yeah, I'm gonna point to Cody Johnson from Some More News, who is a popular lefty YouTuber who has spoken on this. He has an episode. It's not just him. He also works with Katie Stoll and some other people. But they have an episode called "Are Men Okay?" In which they discuss this issue. And he does turn right to the camera and he's like, "You want some dating advice? Make friends with women. Learn how to talk to people. Ask people out when you're interested, and then don't get upset if they're not interested back. Move on." Like, these are the
Right.
kinds of advice it's everywhere. It's not actually hard to find somebody saying that kind of stuff. But he says he understands that the misogynist advice is more attractive because it says you don't need to change. The world needs to change.
Right.
You don't have to learn anything. Women need to learn how to act like the sex objects that they are.
Right.
And then everything will get better. So what we really
Everything
need
has been messed up.
Yeah.
Everything has been messed up. You are the victim, and you are simultaneously not only the victim, but you are, as you noted, Caitlin, you are without fault. So you're the victim and you are perfect.
Yeah.
What could be better to feed to somebody who perceivably lacks self-esteem than that?
That's what I wanna hear if I have a problem, right? Is like someone's hurting you, just get them back, as
Yeah.
opposed to like, you gotta learn how to do some things a little differently.
But yeah, that's exactly it, right? Like I say, like, what people want to hear is that it's always someone else's fault,
Mhm.
right? Um,
I also think that dating is scary, and, like,
hmm,
it's okay to be scared of it, and you
yeah,
have to put yourself into situations that are scary. For example, going
Right.
out to these mixers and things, but it is risky. You do risk feeling rejected. You risk reminding yourself of your own loneliness if it doesn't go great. And so that's like you just have to have an appetite for or a tolerance for that feeling.
Yeah, and I think, both with the young men are depressed and the young men are lonely,
Mhm.
as object level statements, they're true enough, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, rates of people who report themselves as being lonely, or who don't have close friends, or don't have relationships, or don't have sex, or whatever, they're about the same for young men and young women. So we never talk about the female side of this, but there,
Yeah.
plenty of people out there, things aren't going the way that they would want them to. I tried to be clear in both of my articles on this. I'm not saying that like everything's perfect or that's not the case. What I am saying is if you take the easy answer of someone saying it's everyone else's fault, that will make your own life worse,
Yeah.
reliably so. And that the people offering you that answer do not care about you.
Yeah.
You are a click on their video. You are a marketing dollar to them, and they want you upset and angry and frustrated because you're exploitable that way.
Mhm.
You're financially or you're politically exploitable. You being angry and upset and lonely gives them political and financial power, right? That's the trap I want you to see. I'm not saying, to every young man that actually everything's fine and this is all easy. For some people
Right.
it is. Some people it comes naturally, and for some people it doesn't.
Yeah.
I'm saying that these people are predators and you are the prey.
That's really important. Another aspect of the question of, where's the progressive male masculinity models is whenever we do get somebody that pokes their head up a little too high, they tend to get torn down. So, for example, um, people like to claim that the Democrats didn't really talk about men or like they didn't provide models of masculinity. Well, first of all, Kamala Harris did actually have some policy proposals explicitly to help men. But also, she went on NBC, reassured men that it doesn't make you like that she understands that men are not bad and that, like, it we're not a country of sexist or whatever. But also, we had Tim Walz, right? This was a person who came out with a strong dad identity where
Yeah.
he said, I am a man and masculinity is a part of my way that I interface with the world, including but not limited to my dadliness, my sportsliness, and my car knowledge, right? And what happened to him? He got called Tampon Tim. He got, what did Gad Sad call him? Rear end admiral. Like, what are we doing, buddy?
Yes.
Yeah, he was kind of perceived as a gender traitor in a lot of ways, right? In the same way as the people we're told we need to pity are unwilling to accept non-misogynistic dating advice or life advice. They're unwilling to accept non-misogynistic male role models.
Mhm.
The left doesn't offer male role models is bizarre to me. But Barack Obama,
Yeah.
like, I have plenty of criticisms actually as Obama's political project and
Yeah.
his politics, but as a person, as a man,
It's
this is
perfect.
not.
Yeah.
It does not read to me as a feminine figure. Not that there's would be wrong with him being feminine,
No,
but the guy
that's not what
who's
he was doing. It's just
no,
not.
Right.
he seems to me to be not just a fairly traditionally masculine figure, but quite an elevated form of that. The guy who can pull the trigger on the Bin Laden mission and sing Amazing Grace in church is equally comfortable playing basketball or reading an academic paper. He's a good father and loyal husband. There's never been, as far as I'm aware, no sex scandals with him or anything. He seems and is genuinely a role model to young boys. My two young nephews love Obama, right?
Yeah.
But
It seems to me that's and I mention Obama because if there's one person people across the left actually quite liked in the last 2 decades, and when they're the person who speaks for our side of the aisle, much more than Biden or Hillary or whoever, it was Obama, right?
Yeah.
And but so does it ever like clock in their head? Oh, the left doesn't offer male role models. Who have we had speaking for us for the
Right.
past generation?
Yeah, and they'll go
Right.
as far as to say, like, media doesn't have any male role models, and it's like, I don't know if you've ever caught, like, the Marvel Cinematic Universe or the Star Wars
Yeah.
universe, but there's actually quite a lot of male protagonists in there. I'm wearing my Frozen shirt because I was reminded that, like, Kristoff from Frozen for children is a pretty good example of a guy who does the movie heroism stuff, but
Hmm.
is a normal person to the women in his life. And, obviously that makes him a cuck or whatever. So, and then Trent, here's your chance to make fun of me because I put Bandit from Bluey in the notes. Toby was like, I don't know what that is. But, Bluey is a show for, like, preschool age children, so I have preschool age children, they love Bluey, I love Bluey, it's a really nice look at parenting, and, the inner lives of children in a fun
Right.
8-minute cartoon, but the father is his name is Bandit, and he is, literally an example to people my age of good parenting and of being a good man. And he even struggles with competitiveness. There's an episode where he like sabotages his own daughter in a race because he can't handle the idea of losing to her, and then they have to like redo it. It's a fun episode. Anyway,
Right.
the point being, there are good male role models everywhere for those with eyes to see them, including a cartoon dog.
Right. Right. But again, like, and I really wanted to for a second, Toby, fixate on what you said concerning Obama, because for many who follow the presidents and follow the historical nature of the presidency, many of us have said that Obama is like the most intellectual president that the country had probably since like John Quincy Adams to varying degrees. And I like to use that comparison because John Quincy Adams was not overly appreciated during his lifetime for similar qualities that I think that certain folks in America do not appreciate Obama for, right? Like what you just said, he plays basketball, he smokes cigarettes, he reads, he's a genius, he's a constitutional professor, right? He does all these things, and yet there's some strain in America that doesn't want that. They want something that feels more realistic, whether it be a Donald Trump, who we saw come after Barack Obama, or an Andrew Jackson, who
Hmm.
beat out John Quincy Adams despite not knowing how to spell it properly, right? So we see this sort of dichotomy of what we conceive of a man to be, or a positive good figure, right? And what others perceive man to be, what a positive good figure is. And they don't always reconcile. And I
Yeah.
think that leaves the liberal and the left sometimes a little confused, because we say to ourselves, well, like you just said, Obama, we have policy disagreements, but this is somebody who everyone should clearly see as a good role model as a human. And yet, no,
Well,
the
this
smartest people are not always conceived in that way.
this gets back to Toby's point about like any consideration of women as equal contributors to society or members of society is unacceptable, right? Because the one thing that all of those men have in common is that they don't expect for men to be the only kind of person who gets any consideration. And so I also want to bring up this book called Language Myths, which is fairly old now, it is aging, but it in it there's a chapter about the idea that women speak too much, and it references a few different studies in which uh if you mess with a scenario and make it so that men and women are talking the same amount, people that you survey afterwards will say the women were dominating the conversation, the women were talking too much, why couldn't the women shut up? And it's because equal participation is unacceptable at this point.
Yeah, people genuinely don't believe in inequality, right? And a certain chunk never did, and another chunk can be radicalized into that. With the Obama point, I think there is something where people can find intellectuals frustrating and effete and annoying. I'm not sure Obama really gave that vibe. Like I said, I think he had enough traditionally masculine qualities that this is someone I think you could plausibly put forward as someone for young boys
Sure.
to look up to. And add another element to why the right would reject Obama as a potential role model beyond the obvious racism,
Mhm.
Of course.
um, is liberalism writ large is perceived as feminine. It appears as
Yes.
female coded, right?
Yes.
So Caitlin can probably do a better job of explaining what I mean by female coded, but like a classic example is we talk about Disney villains being queer coded, right? So the Jafar or Scar, right? The language, the affectation, the way they're portrayed. It's never quite said that they're queer, but it's kind of
Yeah.
like you expected to pick up on it, right?
Yeah.
Now, that can happen with people. It can also happen with abstract entities. So
Yeah.
a lot of the ways that we've been talking about the political left and the political right for, I would say, at least 3 decades now, possibly quite a lot longer, rely on stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. So going back to the Gingrich era, you would have them talking about latte sipping liberals, right? Today, you mentioned the word cucks. They also talk about soy boys and beta
Yes.
males. They're very
Yeah.
actually concerned with what we put in our coffee, aren't they?
Yeah.
But what are the but
You
what
know
does
what? I got
what
Premier Protein in my coffee, so am I a man
yeah.
now?
I personally will go for oat milk, which I'm just proving my
Oh,
own lack of
oh
manhood
boy.
right here. But
Oh no.
oat milk is quite good in coffee, actually. I think it's actually slightly
Yeah.
nicer than regular milk
That
and better
the
for you.
There's an extra taste in there that's very nice, isn't there?
Yeah.
All milk is fine. There's nothing feminine about drinking 2% milk. These are absolutely insane
It is
But
abstract
outrageous.
ideas.
but what's being said isn't supposed to be literal, right? What are they actually
Right.
saying? They're saying you're insufficiently masculine, you're
Right.
effeminate, maybe you're gay, right?
Yeah.
Like
Mhm.
that's sort of what they're saying.
Oh,
No,
well, we've talked about this in other episodes too, where, it's the connecting of the politic to the, personal to say something like empathy is girly, caring about other people is girly, therefore policies that help people are also girly and, like, communist and,
Tampon Tim.
it all lives in one exactly,
Yeah,
tampon tip.
you also get that's like George Makoff, who has like the mum party and the dad party as an
Oh my
idea
god,
that
yeah.
picks up on that. That certainly I would say issue support.
And then we
Um,
have Tucker Carlson saying that, like, Trump is gonna spank us like the bad girls that we are, so, sometimes it gets quite literal.
so yeah, I mean, I don't know how explicit we want to be on this podcast, but a lot of there is a strong fetish element to a lot
Mhm.
of the language that comes out of the new right.
You're allowed to say that.
I'll say that. I won't be more explicit than that. But so to relate that to Obama, I think the challenge there is he is appearing as the head of the Democratic Party, which is the institutional representation of mainline liberalism in this country, which is all female coded. So I honestly think, and this often works at both a conscious and a subconscious level, it wouldn't even occur to them to consider him as a masculine role model because he's the head of a female coded
Right.
entity,
No, I think that's
right?
very
Right.
fair, yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, this does also get back to the concept of heroic masculinity as entailing kind of a compulsory heterosexuality and a focus on the nuclear family. So you look at some of these discussions of heroic masculinity, and they often come back to Heather McDonald does this explicitly in her PragerU video. Being a good man means being a worthy husband and a good father. You get Jordan Peterson talking to Elon Musk about how, oh God, that whole conversation was painful, but talking about how the archetype of the male is Christ, and Christ interfaces with the world and the world of ideas, and he is his own person. And then the archetype for the female is Mary, who is shown with a baby at all times, essentially, or tending to the crucified Christ, somewhere, some kind of maternal relation. And that, like, that shows us that the true nature of the female is never to exist in her own right, and that would be wrong, that it is to be the mother, but also that, like, the the father is an important aspect of heroic masculinity, even though Christ didn't have any children. I won't worry about that, I guess, if Jordan Peterson doesn't. So and you have somebody like Elon Musk, who is a public atheist, saying, yes, well, when countries lose their religion, they turn antinatalist and they go into decline. And I think this goes back to your discussion in your essay about how the whole idea of heroic masculinity is a focus on a very rare aspect of being a person, which is um, an expectation that just isn't realistic, that you're gonna pull somebody out of the ocean like you did, or shield somebody from a bullet, or pull somebody out of a burning building. It's not how we should be living our lives every second of every day. And it's like a traumatic way to live. Similarly, thinking about yourself as like the father of humanity at all times is also just not a reasonable way to go about your day.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the point I made. And what I was trying to say in that article isn't that is bad. And certainly if you are in that moment where an emergency rescue is necessary, you'll certainly be very grateful for someone who rescues you. And on your, if you were the rescuer, you'd want to meet the moment. But they're also just not common, like this is going to happen once or twice in your life, and you'll make an impulsive decision. Hopefully everything's okay, and that will be it. It's very difficult to build a stable identity around that. I think if you wanted this to be the core of your personality, you'd have to have a profession that involved that sort of risk, like being a firefighter or something like that, right? Or being in the army has always been the classic one for men. And all of those professions are more available now to men than they ever have been historically. And by and large, we don't choose them, right? Men fantasize about hero moments, but by and large, we don't seek them out. And I think correctly so. I think there's other forms of service to others, raising children or looking after an elderly relative that are far more forming of your character, and that people take far more joy and satisfaction out of. And that's all fine, good. And now, what I'm not saying is it's better for men to do female-coded forms of support for others, like caregiving, than it is to do male-coded forms like heroics. I'm saying both are available to us. And as it happens, most men, the revealed preference is they actually prefer the female-coded kind. Now, that really runs afoul of this whole worldview that we've been representing, that there are just these innate male urges that drive us towards certain things. And if we don't respect and honor and dignify them, men will be happy and unhappy and confused and frightened. We live in a world of partially realized liberalism and free choice, but as incomplete as it is, anyone can be a firefighter, right? Or almost anyone. Or a soldier,
I will say,
a
lot of energy has been put into keeping women out of those professions, right? So
and this is a very old liberal point that goes all the way back to John Stuart Mill, of if what you're saying is true, that there are just these radically unchangeably different male and female natures, then you wouldn't need to police gender boundaries as much as you feel the need to do. Because if you just let people choose, they'll naturally, if there are just roles and vocations that men are more attracted to and that women are,
why did the fire department change the rules for how to pass the test to get into the fire department when women started applying, if women are just naturally not suited to being firefighters?
It's the same thing in the miscegenation discussion that happened in this country once upon a time. If groups weren't naturally finding attraction towards one another as individuals, then there would be no need to create laws. Right? But again, where the virtue of this sort of heroic masculinity, quote unquote, this sort of ambiguous, vague construct, it would, as Toby sort of alluded to, like perhaps be conceived of as a virtue in a time where like there is less civilized structure and cooperation. But
I would still say it can be a virtue. If you pull someone from a burning building, that is a virtue. I'm not knocking that.
But a virtue that, as you noted, you could build a consistent self-perception on top of without being in that type of industry already.
I think that's challenging, right? Like, say you do that and you pull someone from a burning building. What are you going to do? Tell that story in every conversation you have
Oh
forevermore?
my gosh.
Just sit meditating in
Exhaust your
satisfaction on the
friends,
fact that
alienate
you,
your relatives.
The,
yeah,
the, but we know that there are people that do that, right? We know
and
that there are folks who
They're
throw the
dining
winning
out. Yeah.
touchdown. Oh, they threw the winning touchdown in 1974, and you got to hear about it until 2054, right?
yeah, and at root, my suspicion would be that beyond being insufferable, that those people aren't happy,
Of
right?
course, which is
And
sad.
I'll go you one further. There's people who've never even have the moment and live in anticipation of it.
Right.
Gun nuts who define themselves by being ready
Mm.
for the moment. And again, my suspicion is that they are not happy, and with a certain predictability, much more frequently use their guns to end their own lives than to protect themselves or someone else.
Let's finish up by asking, because I am a rhetoric language person, what are some of the things that you would like for people to keep in their minds when they encounter the narrative of heroic masculinity?
Can I do like a big picture thing to end with? But the
Totally.
heroic listen, being a hero in an ordinary sense is fine. It is good, even, right? I think most of us prefer and find more valuable other forms of care. What I would caution people against is here's what I'll say in closing. Is the narrative of heroic masculinity being used to argue that there is an essential male nature that needs certain conditions and certain support, and an essential female nature that needs supervision and control, say? What gets called biological essentialism. Do
Mhm.
we just have these desires and urges and we need to validate it? I would probably say to people in closing, because that's sort of what we've been circling around the conversation, I think that's false. I'm kind of agnostic on if there's like deep genetic differences and what the
Mhm.
spectrum is and so on. But what I would say is free choice does seem to disprove that. I would also say history disproves that. People
Right.
who talk about heroic masculinity imagine that there has always been a way to be a man consistent throughout human history that now us weirdos and feminists and queers are changing. And it's often left implied, but one imagines it is a worldview that is, patriarchal and monogamous and homosexual, right? None of that is stable throughout human history.
Of course.
Patriarchy is the overwhelming norm, but there have been matriarchies. But even within patriarchies, you have radically different ideas about what manhood involves. I
Yes.
just came off an interview with Moody Al-Rashad, who's wrote a wonderful book. I have it here, in fact, on
Let's go.
the ancient Near East between two rivers. And, so this is the period from maybe 3000 to 1000 BC in Mesopotamia.
Right.
Manhood there was certainly patriarchal. It certainly involved having a certain amount of control over women's bodies. But that was because, you wanted to know that your kids were yours. And that was the extent of the concern with it. Visiting prostitutes, both male and female, was completely normal and acceptable. Male homosexuality was completely normal and acceptable, including, we often think about male homosexuality as effeminate, including between martial men and military
Right.
heroes. One of the oldest texts, literary texts that we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is kind of a love story between two very strong, martial, fighty, heroic men. You might also talk about Achilles and Patroclus in that line, or David and
Right.
Jonathan in the Bible. And while men certainly occupied a position over power of women in marriage, they also could have multiple wives. Not common, but it was a thing. Slaves were also part of the family, and people would have sex with both male and female slaves. Contrary to us, who have in which our slave status is matrilineal. So Sally Hemings' children were understood as hers, not Thomas Jefferson's. It wasn't in ancient Mesopotamia. Children with
Right.
slaves could inherit and be heirs, which seems counterintuitive to us. All of which is to say that is a very, very different understanding of a masculinity that is patriarchal and martial, but also can involve, and in some cases actively requires, romance and sex with other men.
Yeah.
That's just a very different conception. And then you get a different conception of masculinity again in Greece and Rome. You get different conceptions in other cultures around the world. And almost all of that is up for grabs. Is it matrilineal, patrilineal? Is slave status matrilineal or patrilineal? Is it monogamous or polygamous? What are our feelings around extramarital sex? What are our feelings around male and female homosexuality? Because these do. What are our feelings around gender presentation? All of that changes historically.
Abortion, yeah, absolutely.
So
all of it. And so, sorry to put a pin in it.
that's okay,
This idea that there is just a male urge and a female urge is radically historically false.
Absolutely.
And it's radically false in the context of free choice. What someone is saying when they say that is just not true.
Yeah, I think that you need like a healthy skepticism whenever you hear somebody say this is simply how gender works. It is like this. This is just what it is. You got to think like, are there maybe counterexamples? Is there a way that might not be exactly the total truth? The other thing that I wanted to add as the finishing piece of advice is anytime you hear somebody saying no one's willing to talk about this is an ignored issue, the progressives won't admit, the feminists won't admit, whatever, like just take a moment, just go see if that's true, because usually they are hoping that there's a gap in your knowledge and that they can fill it essentially.
Yeah. Final, be aware that this person wants you to be frustrated and angry because they want your clicks, your money, and your political support. Like their purpose isn't to solve your problems. It's to make and to keep you angry because you're exploitable in that state.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Toby. It was amazing speaking with you. I hope we can have you back again soon to talk about, the other things that are of interest to you, not just this one terrible essay.
Yeah, no, masculinity wasn't something that I expected to spend a lot of time on, but I don't know, I did. And I think we have to say something about it because it's just a contour that runs through everything.
People need to think about it because it is a big part of our culture, right?
Yeah, well, no, thank you so much for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. This has been Half the Answer, where knowing the question to ask is half the answer. And we will see you guys later. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Half the Answer, presented by Liberal Currents. You can find Half the Answer anywhere you get your podcasts. Liberal Currents is an entirely listener and subscriber-funded publication, which includes programs like Half the Answer and Neon Liberalism. So, if you like what you've heard and wish to contribute, you may do so at liberalcurrents.com and through Patreon. And remember, understanding a question is half the answer.